Fiat L640 is an Italian light tank from World War II. It was developed between 1936 and 1938 by the Fiat Ansaldo company. The tank began to be delivered to combat units only in mid-1942, but it was actively used on all fronts where Italian troops were fighting. After Italy's surrender, the remaining vehicles were captured by German forces, and at their request, 17 more units were produced in 1944. By the second half of the 1930s, the main tanks in the arsenal of the Army of the Kingdom of Italy were the outdated light Fiat 3000 and the L3 of 33 tankettes. Their experience in the Spanish Civil War, where they encountered the armored vehicles of the Republicans, revealed their almost complete helplessness. Therefore, starting in 1936, accelerated efforts to create modern samples of armored vehicles began in Italy. These were to include light tanks that could be used for reconnaissance, protection, and support purposes. The future light tank was being developed based on the experience of the Ansaldo tankettes. A prototype was built, designated Carro di Assalto 5T Modello 36, but it required improvements. By 1939, the appearance of the future light tank was finally shaped. The first prototype, designated Carro Armato L6 of 40, was presented for testing in 1940. The tank had a classic layout. At the rear was a gasoline engine SPA-18 with a power of 70 horsepower. The armament consisted of, originally a 37mm gun, but on the serial vehicles, a 20mm automatic gun was mounted in a turret that could rotate 360 degrees, as well as one 8mm Breda machine gun. The crew consisted of 2 people, a driver mechanic and a gunner commander. After tests, the tank was recommended for mass production. Mass production began in 1941. However, the first tanks reached the Army only at the beginning of 1942. In terms of its characteristics, the L640 was not inferior to most other light tanks, such as the Soviet T-60, but was significantly inferior to the American M3 in both armament and armor. In April 1940, it was decided to build 583 Carro Armato L640ths tanks. The first combat vehicles were expected to be received in May 1941. However, it was not possible to meet these deadlines. The vehicle continued to be refined. It was clear that there was no point in either the machine gun version or the variant with a 37mm gun. The only remaining weapon option was the 20mm Breda 35 automatic gun. A new, larger version of the turret was introduced. The thickness of its armor around the perimeter was 30mm, while the gun madlet was 40mm thick. Several vehicles were developed based on the L40, including a self-propelled unit and an ammunition carrier. The release dates for the first tanks were constantly pushed back. The Ansaldo factory was overloaded with orders for medium tanks, and another facility was needed. In June 1941, the order for the Carro Armato L6-40 was reduced to 300 units. The main production site became the Fiat head factory, and the hulls were supplied by the steel company Terni Società per l'Industria e l'Elettricità SpA from Terni. The first Carro Armato L6-40, number 3808, was delivered on May 22, 1941. A total of 283 tanks of the first series were produced, receiving registration numbers from 3808 to 4090. They were completed in the fall of 1942, after which production continued. The tank with number 3896 was converted into a prototype Semavant to 47/32. The second series, whose production began in September 1942, consisted of 68 tanks with registration numbers ranging from 5121 to 5189. In addition, one vehicle with the serial number 5165 was converted into an ammunition carrier. By the end of 1942, 36 tanks of the third series, numbers in the range of 5203 to 5239, and 27 tanks of the fourth series, numbers in the range of 5453 to 5470, were produced. In 1943, 14 tanks with registration numbers 5481 to 5489 and 5502 to 5508 were built. They were followed by 29 machines of the last series with numbers 5552 to 5580. In total, 440 tanks were produced before Italy's exit from the war, and 2 machines were converted into self-propelled guns and ammunition carriers. It is worth mentioning another vehicle, the development of which was planned back in 1937. This refers to the flamethrower version of the L6-40. In December 1941, it was decided to convert one of the tanks from the initial batch, with serial number 3812, into a flamethrower vehicle. Instead of the paired installation of a 20mm gun and a machine gun, a new installation was designed for it. Now, a flamethrower was installed in tandem with the machine gun, and a 200-liter tank was placed inside the tank to supply it. The modified vehicle was tested in the summer of 1942, but it did not go into production. After Italy's exit from the war and the occupation of part of its territory by the Germans, Fiat, which found itself in the occupied territory, continued the production of the L6-40, but for its new owners and under a different designation, PZ KPFW.L6 2 cm 733 I. The Germans ordered 14 units. By the end of 1943, 15 standard tanks and 1 command tank were built. In 1944, another command vehicle was produced. The outdated tank was not of interest to the Wehrmacht, but the self-propelled unit based on it had some combat value. Therefore, many more vehicles were built based on the L6-40. The equipping of the Italian army with L6-40 tanks began in the spring of 1942. The Italians' allies, the Germans, were puzzled as to why a tank class similar to their light PZ.2 was needed, especially since by that time the Germans themselves had begun to actively convert them into much more effective self-propelled guns Marder with 75mm guns. Unlike other Italian tanks, which were produced in significantly larger quantities, the L6-40 was used, albeit limitedly, on almost all fronts of World War II where Italy was involved. About 3 dozen of these tanks were sent to the Eastern Front in July 1942. All were lost during the Battle of Stalingrad, and a few survivors became trophies. Tanks of this type were delivered to North Africa in April-May 1942 and also in limited quantities. In the Second Battle of El Alamein, most of these vehicles, which were part of the 133rd Tank Division, were lost. The last tanks of this type in Africa were destroyed during the defensive operation in Tunisia in the spring of 1943. L6-40 participated in anti-partisan operations in Yugoslavia and Albania. After Italy's capitulation in September 1943 and the occupation of the northern and central parts of the country by German forces, as well as the disarmament of Italian troops in Yugoslavia, the surviving tanks were adopted by the Germans under the designation PZ KPFW.L6 I. Additionally, 17 more of these vehicles were manufactured on order from the Germans. After the war, the surviving tanks of this type were transferred to the army of the newly formed Italian Republic, where they served for several more years.